Hello and welcome from my side as well to our event ZEIT for Democracy. My name is Hegemann. I'm the editor for all things digital at ZEIT Online. And in the following panel, we discuss a topic that influences our everyday life, automation. How does it influence how we live? And how can we, as a society, participate how these systems are regulated? I'm very happy to welcome my panelists. Alexandra Geese is a member of the German Green Party and member of the European Parliament, where she is a shadow rapporteur for the Digital Services Act and works on ethical questions in AI and automated decision-making systems. Hello. I would also like to welcome Carly Kine. She's the director of the Lovelace Institute, an independent research organization. Great to have you with us today.
Thank you. Hi.
Paola Pierri is the head of design and research at the Democratic Society, one of Europe's leading democratic innovation organizations. Thanks for joining our discussion today. Hello.
Thanks for inviting me. Hi.
And last but not least, a warm welcome to Matthias Spielkamp. He's the co-founder and managing director of the German non-profit AlgorithmWatch. Hello.
Hey.
When we talk about automated decision-making systems and how they influence our lives, I think it's important to first talk about how these systems work and what they can do. Matthias, how do those systems make decisions? Can you expand on that a little?
It's a very wide variety of systems that we are talking about. What most people are certainly familiar with are what we call recommender systems in the expert community, and what we just see as recommendations for certain content. That happens on Facebook, where you get recommendations for certain posts of your friends or the community you're in, or it happens on YouTube, where some videos are recommended to you. And the technology behind that is that the system, I call it a system, it's not an algorithm on its own, it's not just data, it's a very complex thing, is trying to find out what you like based on different signals. It could be your past surfing behavior, it could be the number of likes you give to a certain post, and it accumulates that and tries to analyze that and make predictions about what is the next thing you like. And then it suggests to you that content. And that is one part of it. And I'd like to quickly mention another one, because it is also used in the public sector. It is used, for example, in managing welfare. Not so much in Germany, because we are pretty far behind when it comes to digitization of the public sector, but it is used around Europe to, for example, make decisions who gets money for, who will get unemployment benefits, or sometimes the opportunity to just participate in some trainings, for example. And of course, it becomes really, really relevant for people's life chances and opportunities that they enjoy in. So I think it's important to talk about these.
Paola, at first sight, some of these systems seem rather harmless. For example, when talking about how Netflix recommends a new show to me. Still, our topic today is democracy. How can those systems affect our democracy by, for example, recommending things? Matthias mentioned welfare, for example. Can you expand on that?
Yes, happy to. I mean, one thing that I want to add on how ADM and automated decision-making systems work is that they are very much depending on context. So we might, I mean, I think where in some contexts and when they are affecting lives of certain groups of people, especially, so for instance, those more marginalized, I think the question of democracy and the question of inclusion, for instance, comes absolutely to the fore. The problem with automated decision-making, one of the problems with automated decision-making is that you have an outcome, a decision, but very rarely or pretty much never, you do have an argument. You have a reasoning behind that decision. So there is this, what is being called like a black box issue with automated decision-making, so decision-making that is done only by the algorithm, so without human intervention, where the issue is that people don't have ways of accessing the reasoning behind the decisions that have been that are affecting their lives. So a decision is taken whether or not you receive employment benefits, for instance, but you have no ways of understanding the reasoning behind. So issues of accountability, issues of transparency, issues of legitimacy. What happens and who is responsible, for instance, when a decision like this is taken about people's lives, citizens' life, and the reasoning behind is not even accessible. It's not transparent, and people cannot access that. We do have a democratic society when it comes to talk about participation. I think that there's a functional aspect to that. So it's useful because it improves. People should be involved. Because that improves the decisions that are made about their life. But there's very much a democratic argument as well, which is in fact saying that people need to be involved in decisions that shape their lives. So in that more wider approach and democratic approach to people, civic engagement, public participation, in that space, I think it's important that people are involved in digital conversations much more than they are right now, and especially on automated decision making.
Mm-hmm. Carly, Paola just talked about discrimination, possible discrimination in these systems. That is not exactly new. It might only be differently distributed through automatic decision-making systems, because we as people, of course, have biases, and these biases show in the systems as well. In the manner of don't shoot the messenger, is the technology really the problem, or are we as people, because we build this, the biases into the systems?
Yeah, it's a really great question, and it's something that you hear quite a lot when you talk about bias and discrimination in systems, which is that people say, well, humans are biased, of course, computers will be biased, and in fact, maybe computers are less biased than humans. I think Paola touched on why bias is and discrimination is such a pernicious aspect of automated decision-making, which is that it is often obscured by the very system itself. The technology gives the decision an air of objectivity. It makes it seem like the decision is independent or free from bias often. And so you have this kind of, this idea of computer says no, that people are really behaviorally inclined to defer to technological systems because they seem more objective, more accurate. But it's really, really important to break down the various human factors that go into automated decision-making. And of course, at the end of the day, all technology, all in particular artificial intelligence is, it's humans all the way down. Humans are involved in every aspect of the design, every aspect of the process. And so I think when we think about how to redress discrimination and bias in algorithms, we have to kind of separate it out, the various parts of the process in which it originates. So right from the design of a piece of technology or a system, which is often done by a certain subset of people, in most cases Silicon Valley, which represents a kind of white male cohort, very often is not a representative group of people asking what type of technology should we design. And then there's the input into the system. So that's the data, the raw data that gets crunched through in order to enable the algorithm to make decisions. And we know, I think the public understands very well by now how data sets are often biased, both through lack of representativeness and through systematic bias, which exists in our society. And then there's the kind of embedding the system, and are these systems being deployed in a biased or discriminatory context? And we see that, for example, around predictive policing, which is that algorithms are often used to police particular neighborhoods that are already over-policed because of racial biases, for example. So, it's a much more complex and nuanced question than just, is a system discriminatory or not? I think the important takeaways are, just as we can't just snap our fingers and fix societal bias, we can't snap our fingers and have a bias-free or discriminatory-free algorithm. And so we need to account for that. The users of the system need to understand where the system might be going wrong. And we need to move away from this idea of just deferring to algorithms as a kind of accurate measure of society.
Mm-hmm. Mrs. Geese, as a member of the European Parliament, why do you believe it is important to regulate these systems, but also how can we do that?
That's a difficult question as well, especially how can we do that? I think, first of all, what we have to acknowledge is that we have a total asymmetry of knowledge. So the company that is developing that ADM system has all the data about us and the rest of society. It does the modeling. It takes the decision on how to optimize that model. But I, as an affected person who is chosen or not chosen by that system, I don't know anything. I don't know what the system knows about me. I don't know how the model is built. I don't know what it is optimized for. So I can't even improve my own performance in order to increase my chances because I don't know. And this is why we need public scrutiny. We need a public instance that is able to gather that information. What is in the data set? How is the modeling being done? What is the model optimized for? And above all, what is the outcome? Is it working according to the functions it has been built for? Is it really fulfilling its purpose? And this is something I can't do as an individual. This is something society has to do in terms of an independent authority. From my point of view, possibly for bigger systems, a European authority. And this is really where we need public scrutiny, and this is what we need regulation for. Then we have the problem that we do have fundamental rights enshrined in our legal systems, but ADM systems make it very difficult to make sure these rights can really be enforced, because I have this asymmetry of knowledge. I don't know if I don't see an ad, or I'm not called for an interview in a recruitment process, or I don't get credit, for example, because I'm just simply not eligible, or because I'm a woman or people of color, and that algorithm decided I'm not worthy of it. So we need to make sure that we have procedures to enforce the fundamental rights that are already enshrined in our legislation. And then I think there's a basic ethical aspect to consider. Our liberal democracies are built on the idea of an individual making free choices. But ADM systems don't consider me as an individual, but as part of a group. And that becomes problematic because it really clashes with the philosophy which our societies are built on as liberal democracies. And this is, I think, where we need to have a broad discussion in society where we actually want those systems and which kind of systems, and where we decide that the free choice of the individual is more important than being subject to a ranking by an automatic decision-making system. And this is something where we need the data, we need to make all this public, and this is why we need regulation and public scrutiny.
Thank you so much. I love that you touched the point of society getting involved, because that's, of course, the topic of our discussion today. And luckily, we have a few people who are actually building or trying to get society making an impact in those decisions. Carly, you, for example, designed a rapid online public deliberation during the first lockdown to talk about COVID and technologies. How did that work? And can you also explain what was the aim of the project?
Yeah, absolutely. So the Ada Lovelace Institute is a research institute, and one of the research methodologies we use is public engagement. So these types of deliberative exercises with members of the public to really understand from them in an informed way how they think technologies, data and AI should be governed and used, regulated and deployed. And we've done this across a number of different issues related to technology and data. So things like health data partnerships between private and public sector, the use of biometrics technologies and facial recognition. And then around COVID, we've done a number of different exercises around different technologies deployed in response to the pandemic. Last summer, so about 3 months after the pandemic began, as we saw the emergence of a number of different technologies, in particularly contact tracing apps, we convened with a number of other organizations a rapid online public deliberation. And this was, I suppose, distinct from other work we've done in a couple of respects. One is that it was entirely online, and previously we had run these types of initiatives in person. And secondly, it was quite rapidly convened and brought together. And normally you'd want quite a bit of time to really put into planning the process, the syllabus and to recruiting participants. But there was such a contentious debate at the time around the use of contact tracing apps that we felt it could be better informed by more public engagement. So we convened about 30 members of the public over Zoom, of course, like everything else in the last 18 months. Over the course of 3 weeks, they joined us for a couple of hours every night or every second night. And over the course of that period, we had a number of different experts present to them about the potential benefits of contact tracing apps, their technical design, their epidemiological underpinnings, the legal issues, the privacy concerns, the questions around inequalities and impact and discrimination. And so the public got to hear a range of different perspectives on whether contact tracing apps are a good thing or a bad thing for society. And then they got to work in small groups and then as a cohort to really debate and discuss, do we think these are a good idea? Under what conditions should they be used? What should the rules be around contact tracing apps? What are the risks that we're most worried about, etc.? And in this case, they came up with 4 sets of recommendations or findings. One was that they wanted to see a clear and transparent evidence base to support the idea that apps could be useful in countering the pandemic. They felt there was lots of claims being made, but that the evidence base wasn't clear at the time. So that was a very key finding. Second, they wanted clarity around the data, the use of their data. And it wasn't that they didn't want their data to be used as part of the pandemic response, but they wanted to better understand how long that data would be used, when would the app be sunsetted, how would their data be deleted, when does the pandemic end and when would the app stop being used. They wanted to know that there was independent oversight and control over the app. So they wanted some kind of ethics body or independent regulator to be overseeing the use of a contact tracing app, even where it was being deployed by the health system, the National Health Service, which enjoys very high levels of trust in the UK. They still wanted an external body to be overseeing or scrutinizing the use of this app. And then the final finding was they wanted to be reassured that we're all in this together. They didn't want to feel that certain groups of society were being discriminated against or who weren't benefiting. So they were flagging issues around inequalities, potentially the digital divide, stopping older people from using apps in a context in which the older people were disparately affected by COVID. So they were really kind of pulling at the threads of some of the rationale for these apps. So it was a very nuanced, very informed set of findings that we were able to then take to policymakers, designers of the app, and really try to help inform the way they were thinking about rolling out contact tracing apps at the time.
Mm-hmm. And what did you do with the results? So you gave them, what happened with the results was the other question.
Yeah, well, good question. I mean, it's always quite difficult to trace the impact of these types of initiatives because it can be quite a qualitative and often slow burning impact, I think. I think one thing we got to inform the debate around was certain specific concerns around certain groups. So, for example, lots of the work on contact tracing was based on a lot of assumptions about how people behave when they use apps, including if an app tells you to stay home, there was an assumption that you would stay home. And I think that this exercise really showed that people were questioning how other factors might play into that. For example, if you have to stay home, do you lose your income during the period in which you're at home? And therefore, might certain socioeconomic groups be less likely to comply with a ping from the app, a notification to stay home? And so this group of people were able to help tease out some of those concerns. Equally, the idea that certain groups might be more wary of surveillance by the state using their phone for privacy considerations. And so I think that rich content had been missing from the debate, and we were able to really bring that to policymakers in a way that wasn't about saying we as an interest group want to make this an issue, but rather saying we've spoken to people and normal people on the street have raised these as concerns, so that means you really need to start addressing them. In the long term, we saw things like the UK government eventually introduced compensation for people who had to stay home from work that even initially you couldn't claim that if you just got the app told you to stay home. You could only claim it if a human contact tracer told you to stay home. And eventually they introduced the ability to claim money via the app, things like that. So again, it's quite hard to kind of connect the outcome with the deliberation itself. But in my opinion, it added to a more richer conversation.
Mm-hmm. Paola, in the Democratic Society actually does those deliberations, or rather you have a public engagement program. For example, in Scotland, you designed a program to discuss the hopes and worries that people are facing considering using artificial intelligence. How do you get people to participate, and how do you choose them? How's the process working?
So we have been doing, as I said at the very start, a lot of democratic innovation and deliberative democracy exercises in different contexts. So we come with quite a few years of expertise in this field. And one of the things that we always say about quality of participation and good quality of participation is that you need to have three things at least, which is like the opportunity for people to participate, the information in order to be able to form an opinion, and then the confidence. And these three things are immediately quite complex when it comes to digital, because there are very few opportunities to be engaged in that space. And I think the development of the AI digital strategy, national digital strategy in Scotland, was a really interesting example of how they did it, in fact, in a really participatory way, listening from different groups, including the general public, so citizens and people from Scotland. And that's the part that we ended up running for them. So we were appointed by the Scottish Government and the Data Lab to design this program of public consultation on the development of the strategy. But the opportunities many times are missing. The second part, which is what this exercise actually did a lot of the AI project, is the information part. This is fundamental. And this is also, again, very well-known principle in so-called deliberative democracy exercises, where you start by receiving information from usually opposing parts. That's another important element. So you listen from experts, or you listen or read reports or have videos, but the opinions and the information that you're given try to be as comprehensive as possible of the different opinions and the different positions that are available out there on a specific topic. The information part is fundamental because, of course, it's the way in which you do develop your own opinion about something. And this is where I think in the digital field, you have two issues. One is like what I was saying at the very start, because of this black box concept and paradigm, and many times the information is not really there, and it's really difficult even to explain to people how these things work. So we try to do it by bringing it down to the everyday, the material impact that these things have on their life, the things that you were mentioning before. Netflix, actually, the way Netflix suggests you the next video, the next movie that you might be interested in, wanted to watch, is actually based on these simple mechanisms. This does two things: allows people to understand how the use of algorithms and the use of AI is actually much more diffused than what we imagine in everyday small, simple act, and how actually this works in practice. And of course, one thing is on Netflix, and one thing is when you use automated decision-making and algorithms in welfare states, as we were discussing at the very start. Mm-hmm. The third part is the confidence part, which is unfortunately what takes much longer time, and is the part where you need to build, I believe, the digital literacy and the critical digital literacy so that people can engage. And this has two components, and this is something interesting that we found out in the AI work, but very much on another project we run with citizen engagement in 4 cities in Europe, where you learn that actually digital literacy is important for citizens across the board, I mean, for all different groups, but it's also very important for policymakers and for civic servants. Because in order for them to open up the participatory process, this is something we've learned in many years of doing these things, they need to be able and confident themselves of understanding the topic. This is almost like the first step before you feel confident enough to open that process to consultation and participation. And many times, elected officials and civic servants do not understand these things very well, for all the reasons that we're just saying. I mean, it's absolutely normal. In the AI example, we run more than 15 workshops and involved almost 50 people. We did build it on the principles of deliberative democracy, as I was explaining it before. So we started with information, and we started by providing people information from different sources on specific topics. Facial recognition, how algorithmic bias works and what it is, and many, many other practical implications of how these things impact on your life. We did it. One thing to be said, I guess, and many of us actually have done this during the pandemic, which means the AI Scottish engagement plan was designed to be originally delivered in person and had to be delivered online. So we can just imagine how many additional issue of, inclusivity and digital gaps and access to digital resources, how many more issues actually we were confronted with by doing this online. So that's interesting, that I believe the example from Ada Lovelace from Carrick was also, like, of course, ran digitally. So that's an interesting challenge that we all had to face. We did events like workshops, but we also did send to people packages, information pack with materials that they could read in advance. And we also did more like engaging type of activities, like quiz on different topics. And that was also trying to engage a different audience in terms of age as well. So trying to reaching out to young people and children as well. We did recruitment part was absolutely crucial, and we did it through networks of existing network. We tried to do it a little bit offline as well, which is always like a good practice, but that was very difficult because it was at the very beginning of the pandemic. So it was very difficult to do anything in person. One important thing is that we did provide one-to-one, even phone call support for people that had issues with accessing online resources or using online resources, even things simple like Zoom. At that time, were very new for everybody. And we also did work, which was an interesting experiment that we did in a way with families. So we had families talking to each other from different backgrounds and social backgrounds. And the additional value of having families involved is that we had different age groups talking to each other. And it was interesting because, of course, it was not just within one family, but it was across families from different areas and different backgrounds. And we learned many things, but I don't want to, I don't know if maybe, I'm going too long. So I'm going to stop here because there's going to be time to talk more about this later.
We'll talk about this in the discussions in a second. Mrs. Geese, you have been vocal about discrimination in artificial intelligence and automation decision-making systems for quite some time now. And you also, as a politician, of course, represent your constituents. How do you get in touch? How do you get to know their fears? Because, of course, that's also a part how society can interact by talking to politicians and make sure they know their fears. How do you do that, and how does that work?
Well, I try to use every opportunity I have, which was not so easy during COVID because it was basically digital communication, which excludes a subset of people. This is something I have to acknowledge. On the one hand, it was very easy to build up an international conversation about that, but you don't reach everybody if you don't have the possibility to speak to people and to meet people physically. So that was the first problem. I tried to bring up the issue whenever I meet organizations or people, even in order to talk about other things. For example, when I spoke to Caritas, which is the Catholic welfare organization, I brought up ADMs and artificial intelligence because it hugely affects the people those organizations care for, like poorer people, disadvantaged people. And I see there's not much awareness. And this is what something I would like to pick up on from what Paola said that I think was very important. It's a lack of knowledge about these systems in society and a lack of confidence to deal with them. Mm-hmm. There is a lack of understanding that artificial intelligence or automating decision-making systems are not so much a technical issue or technical concern, but they really pose a huge challenge for society. And I think this is sort of the message I'm trying to send out to people and to organizations dealing with other issues. Get involved, because this is about women's rights. This is about equal opportunities for poorer people. this is about an open society for people, whatever their skin color might be. You know, this is about anti-racism, about women's rights. And so I'm trying not to frame it that much as a technical question, but saying, well, this is about the society we want to live in. So please get involved. And I think it's very important to send out this message. I mean, it's good to understand how the technology works, but you don't need a master's in information technology in order to come into the conversation. What is really lacking in this conversation is the voice of society, of social rights organizations, of trade unions, and so on, you know, women's rights organizations, and so on, everybody, basically the churches. This is really what is lacking. When they approach me, I think that the worries are about bias, which is quite obvious. And we discussed that before. The people who would be most badly impacted by the technologies are the ones who are less likely to have a strong voice in policy making, and who are less likely to go to court in case they are being discriminated against, because it's mainly poorer people who can't afford that or don't have a history of their lives where they're used to be able to enforce their rights. So this is a real problem. And when you say the problem is that the data sets basically are built in a way that they discriminate exactly against the same people who will not be able to take part in the policy making. So bias is a big issue. Then I think generally the idea of loss of control in society is a big issue here, because often we already feel we don't really have control over our lives. We can't decide everything. We don't have a big voice. Things sort of get decided at different levels by big business, by foreign businesses at times. I think there's a general fear of loss of control in societies, and automated decision making, which you don't understand, will add to that. So if you're not recruited and you don't understand the process by which people are being selected, this will add to this fear of loss of control. And I think this really fuels conspiracy theories and that kind of beliefs. If you have the feeling you don't control things, you look for strange explanations. And I think that is not beneficial for our society. And the third aspect that hasn't been mentioned much in this debate, I think, is the whole issue of labor and employment. How many jobs will we have in the future, which is an issue which is dealt with in a different debate, but I think it does fit in here, because I think as a society, we need to have a conversation about what is employment, what is labor, what kind of labor do we want to pay for in the future, which is not being discussed much in these artificial intelligence kind of circles, but it's really something that people out there are interested in, and rightly so.
Yeah, thank you for the insight, and a very good point. Before we jump into the discussion, and you mentioned a lot of points that I would like to touch on in the discussion, Matthias, I would like to talk about AlgorithmWatch and the work you are doing, because AlgorithmWatch is known for suggesting transparency for, as the name says, algorithms, but also automated decision-making systems. And you're also known for your automating society reports. And in a report from 2020, I found a very interesting a point where in Greek at the border there was a software supposed to be used to control travelers, and if I remember correctly, it actually wasn't tested with people. What should politicians do to get a broader view of people's fears? And also about the possible discrimination through ADM systems. And I'm saying politicians because, of course, when we implement those systems, politicians are usually the people who decide if we get them or not.
Yeah, that's true. But at the same time, I couldn't agree more with what was said before. The last one who mentioned it was Alexandra, saying that there needs to be more engagement in general, but we are facing a very, very complex issue. Climate change is also a very complex issue, but in the end, we know that we need to get those temperatures down and not exhaust so much and things like that. I'm not arguing that it was easier to make that case. We all know that it was not easy, and it took decades, and it's we are far from where we should be. But when you try to explain to people how is your autonomy for example, endangered by the use of these systems, then it becomes complicated. And, you know, politicians are human beings as everyone else, and they are particularly overworked human beings because they have so many files on their table that they are supposed to know about, that it's very hard to understand the intricacies of all this. So, I mean, we can discuss now the political process and how deficient it may be because this is the way it works. But to address the question directly, I think this is what we are trying to achieve by using examples that are concrete, that tell people about concrete consequences of the use of such technologies. You know, someone does not get a training opportunity because the algorithm said no. Someone does not get credit because the algorithm said no, and so on and so forth. This is what we are doing. This is why we call ourselves an evidence-based advocacy organization, because we try to find evidence everywhere. You know, we do it by for example, working with researchers in 16 different European countries, asking them to find these specific examples from their countries, to put it in a report, to make this a more understandable experience that the people have in these countries. And at the same time, what we're also trying to do is, you know, some people would call it citizen science. We are trying to engage people by giving them technical tools that they can use to, for example, donate data to us that we can then use to analyze, for example, how Instagram rates and places content in someone's newsfeed. Also, in the end, to produce a story out of this that can be understood by non-experts. You know, and non-experts are in the general public, you know, people who have an interest in this topic, but as someone said, are not a computer scientist, which they don't need to be to participate in this discussion. And of course, politicians most of the time are also non-experts. So it's that storytelling that this is about, and that we try to infuse into that debate. But of course, you know, there's always a fine line. When you run around and scandalize everything that is being done with technology, this is also not what we would like to achieve, because we all want technology to be used for the common good and to enhance people's freedom and autonomy, but just not to the opposite. So yeah, this is what we are trying to do. And this is why we think, yes, politicians should know about this. And we try to package that information in formats that are easily digestible, but then of course the ball is in their field.
Thank you for explaining how you are working in your societies. I'd like to open the discussion, and before and when I do, I would actually like to start with a question that a viewer, someone from the audience asked via Slido. I forgot to say that at the beginning. If you have any questions at all, please feel free to post them via Slido, and we will try to integrate them into our discussion. And the question that this person is asking is, isn't it the core work of a society to educate about these topics in a broader way? And Alex, Mrs. Geese, you actually, when we talked before this panel, you actually talked about digital literacy, which is something Paola touched on as well. Is that something you would like to answer? Is that a question I'll just give that question to you.
Yeah, the interesting question is, who is that society that is supposed to educate people? You know, it's quite a multi-composite kind of thing. So, I mean, it's part of my job, I think, to communicate, but it's also the job of the media to communicate a lot more of that. But then media tell you, well, people are not interested as long as it doesn't concern directly their daily life. So I think one thing we need is more public awareness about how much these systems are already being used. And there's, I think the work of AlgorithmWatch is really, really precious, because when I speak about automatic decision-making or artificial intelligence, which is less precise, but just to make people understand, people say, oh, that's something, oh, that's good that you take care of these issues of the future. And I say, no, this is present. This is not future. These are the systems that are already being used. But even I was surprised when I started in this current job as a member of the European Parliament, and it was a lobbyist of an American company who told me how many million people in Germany are managed in big, famous German companies by algorithms, by ADMs, yeah, whose careers depend on that for recruitment. And I wasn't aware of that, actually, and I think most people are not. And so I think we need to make this information public. I think we need to oblige companies using these systems to say which kind of system they're using, how it works, what is optimized for, and so on. People need to know about this, and then we need to do the public debate. And I think, you know, you really have to talk about that aspect that concerns the daily life of people. I know I have daughters, and I know that girls, for example, are very much affected by the fact that social networks, for example, Instagram, promote in their algorithms pictures of skinny women, women who, you know, respond to the classical beauty model, which is usually and has nothing to do with what real girls or real women look like. And that impacts the life of those girls and women very much. And this is something we need to talk about. So I think we really need to point out these aspects and talk to every subset of the population or population group and make clear how these algorithms already impact their daily life today and how this can evolve. But this is, I think, a task for all of us.
That's actually the key question I keep asking myself. How do we get people to participate in processes that they might not know about, of course? So how do we get to know, how do we make them get to know these processes? That's the first step. But also, how do you make them care? That's one of the questions that I've been asking myself before this discussion. And I'd like to ask all of you now, what do you think? How can we do that?
If I can jump in on this one, just because it made me think about some of the findings from the other project that we did recently finished, which I briefly mentioned, which was all about citizens' voice and digital rights, which is another interesting concept that we haven't really explored on the panel until now. A lot of citizens that we engaged, and it was done, I mean, all recruitment and all engagement was done through local partners in 4 different cities. So the population was quite diverse, and again, coming from different political cultures and coming from cities, Milan, Bordeaux, Tirana, and Amsterdam, with also very different levels of digitalization at city level, as you can imagine. So it was a quite diverse group. And it was interestingly a nice, a shared concern that people had. How do you avoid that answer? When you talk about privacy, for instance, and when you talk about transparency, how do you avoid that answer that many citizens give you sometimes, which is, I've got nothing to hide. That was one of the findings that came very, very strongly, as in, like, of course, there's people that still have not, there's many citizens that have not understood possibly the kind of, that don't have awareness of the fact that these systems, these automated decision-making systems and algorithms are used now and not in the future, and are used in very, in a variety of places, even for people that are not using digital. When it comes to citizens and smart cities, it doesn't mean even if you're not using digital, that the questions of digital rights and the question of privacy affect. I think it's a bit, there's a bit of an assumption that people don't care, and there's a bit of an assumption that people don't know. What was interesting for us was to find out that is a concern that is much more widespread. It's not just expert people or expert in engagement that do worry about how do we make people caring about this stuff. Actually, it's a widespread concern, and I'm very sure that many more people than we actually imagine are concerned about these issues, or they will become more concerned if that information part, if that awareness part happens, if we start doing more of these kind of educational, digital literacy, educational activities. And a lot is happening, and I'm thinking about cities like Berlin, but I'm sure it's very diffused in many places, where groups and communities and local groups many times also with tech experts. This is where dialogue is fundamental. These people get to make the concept more clear and get to do awareness raising on a local level. I think that's absolutely important.
Carly, Matthias, would you like to add something?
Sorry, yeah, I wanted to just contribute to that by saying I think we have a report coming out actually early next week, which is called Participatory Data Stewardship, and it's really about how different methods of participation can help to govern and use data in trustworthy ways. And in that report, we talk about the kind of spectrum of participation. So there are various ways in which the public can participate. And at one end of that is about informing and educating the public and making them feel more informed about how their data and technology is being used. One caution I would make to that, and I think this was kind of the subtext of the previous question which came from the audience, which is, this is not about education shouldn't be about placing the burden on the individual to navigate a very complex world. And I think often we hear, oh, if we just increase digital literacy, then all the problems in the digital domain will go away. And that's really about individualizing what is actually a structural problem and what has led to structural distrust, which is very well founded, in my opinion. And I think too often we hear, we need to educate the public so that they'll trust us more, which is entirely the wrong way to go about it, of course. We need to be more trustworthy so that the public will trust us. But nevertheless, there's a spectrum in which we can better inform people. And then I think that moves right up into engagement. And then at the other end of the spectrum is empowering people to make their own decisions about their data and about technologies. And I think that would be the direction of travel that it would be great to see. So things like data cooperatives, where people have more kind of actual control over their data, I think is the direction of travel in many senses. So it'd be important not to allow, I think, a whole debate around a very rich set of different participatory methods to be boiled down to education is the answer, that digital literacy will solve everything, because I think that risks definitely kind of oversimplifying the issue and also putting the responsibility on the individual for what is a structural problem.
Yeah, I would certainly agree with that, and maybe add one more factor to this. I mean, it was already said that, first of all, there are organizations like ours, and there are politicians like Alexandra who are trying to increase the attention to these topics. And everyone sort of has a role to play. We are also doing journalistic stories, but we are a very small organization. So telling compelling stories also by journalists and the media is a factor here. But again, we have to be careful, because this discussion very often either tells a story of magical technologies that will solve all our humanities problems, and on the other hand, the apocalypse, right? You know, so the robots will take over the world and we will all be enslaved. And both stories, both narratives are wrong. Now, journalism at the same time benefits a lot from controversy, and people tend to read spectacular stories more than the one that are making a very differentiated point. But this is, as I said, the different roles that organizations and individuals have to play. So we all have to be aware that, yes, I again also agree, education is not a solution to this, but education plays a role, politics plays a role. We just had the first discussion between the three contenders for the job of German Chancellor here, and in this first discussion, the term digitization was not mentioned. So you can understand what that probably means for the discussion in our particular country. That is different elsewhere. So we also have to look into all these different directions and see who can further this attention that is necessary for people to understand that they need to engage, because there is this topic that is not a technology topic, but is one of justice and fairness and autonomy and the common good.
Mm-hmm. But how can people engage? Of course, they can vote. That's the easiest way to participate in a democratic society. But what else can they do? How do they find programs that actually make a difference as well? Because of course it's nice to talk about and hear about those things, but to actually make an impact, that's a different story. So first question: where can they participate? And yes, how can we make? I say politicians. I don't mean it as broadly as said, but how can we make politicians care?
Should I start on this one?
If you like.
Well, politicians care if they feel there's a public opinion they have to take into account. So what is important is raising the debate, having a public debate in the media. And what everybody can do is try to get some information and bring it up in her or his own organization, wherever you are, at the workplace. Question, what is your company doing? In your church, try to organize an event about it or something, invite someone, start discussing it, bring it up with your local politician. You know, when as politicians you feel this is something that is being discussed and people care about, you get your information, you do your homework. And there it's striking what Matthias just mentioned is what I noticed as well at the debate we had among the three chancellor candidates. Digitalization or artificial intelligence wasn't even an issue. You know, there were couple of really stupid questions and we didn't talk about something so fundamental. So I think my colleagues, they don't feel the heat. They don't feel this is something people care about. But I think one of the reasons why we have some have the feeling people don't care is because they're the two scenarios Matthias mentioned very rightly so, apocalypse or magical technology solving everything. They have one thing in common. It's a future that happens and you don't build it. It's something that happens to you and you're just completely helpless, and in both views. So I think one more thing we have to point out, that it's not something that's just happening, that we are building it right now. And this is the role of regulation and legislation. So if we have, for example, this deliberative processes, it's very important to make sure the results feed into something. And it's very important to point out every time, and I'm saying this especially to journalists, that there is regulation going on, and that regulation is the place where you take those decisions, where you take what comes out of the outcome of these debates, and then you create the basis for shaping those technologies and for taking decisions. And I think this is something we have to tell, especially the younger generation. I think they're quite aware of what sharing their data means. It's not that they don't understand, it's because they're digital natives. I think they understand it a lot better than people of my generation and older, but they feel they can't do anything about it. And right now it's true. I mean, how do you live without one of the big platforms if you are under 30? I mean, even I can't achieve that. So I think the awareness is there. We have to make sure they have the feeling we can still do something about it. It's not something that big companies decide or some kind of unknown future will decide by himself, but it's us deciding it. And the place to do it is politics and it's regulation. So this is something we have to say, we can shape it, and let's do that.
Unfortunately, I have to cut the discussion short here because we're running out of time. First of all, thank you so much. I think we can all agree with what Alexandra, what Mrs. Geese said. We're going to turn up the heat, or we have to turn up the heat to actually make a difference. Thank you all for taking part in the discussions and your very interesting points of views and your suggestions on how to discuss automated decision-making systems in a more broad way, in a much broader audience. Thank you.